So when I was a first-year student, one of the professors I found very interesting, Larry Sager, was involved with the New York Civil Liberties Union. We ended up working on a case about 6 graduate students at Stony Brook who were suddenly told that they were not allowed to be living together in the house that they had rented because they were violating a zoning ordinance that prohibited a house in this village of Belterre to be used by anything other than a single family. So I went out to see those students and to tell them what was going on. And they took me on a tour of the village, including driving over to the residents-only beach. When the wheels hit the parking lot there, this large man came running across the parking lot and said, "What are you doing here? You are not legal residents. You're not allowed to be here." So they all looked at me. And I'm thinking, well, I'm not very big. What am I supposed to tell this large man who doesn't want us in his parking lot? And so then I remembered I had this federal court order that was right in my bag. So I drew myself up and I said, well, I'm with the New York Civil Liberties Union, sort of. And I have a federal court order here that says that these people are allowed to be at this beach. And he looked at me and he looked at the order and he melted. And I thought, this is cool. I want to do this.
This is Mind the Ceiling, a show about trailblazing women who are shattering boundaries. These are the candid conversations that dig into what the journey to finding purpose and climbing to the top of industries is like. All of the victories, hurdles, bumps and bruises, and celebrations along the way, and the tools you can use to be the next ceiling breaker. I'm your host, Tamara Lane. My guest today is Susan Herman. She is the inaugural Ruth Bader Ginsburg Professor of Law at Brooklyn Law School. However, she may be best known for her instrumental role as the head of the American Civil Liberties Union during some of the organization's most active years. Susan was the president of the ACLU for over 12 years. During the Obama and Trump administration, she oversaw close to 2,000 cases annually, notably defending voters' rights, child separation cases, reproductive rights, and LGBT rights. She is a trailblazer, consistently striving to create open, bipartisan conversation and advocating for human rights and liberties. And this is how she describes her journey to finding purpose.
Convoluted. How about that? Oh, my purpose in life. I think there are so many purposes. Some are private purposes, just to be the person who my family needs me to be. One is for myself, to just sort of feel that I matter and I have a fulfilling life. But professionally, I think I discovered a purpose in my trajectory to becoming president of the American Civil Liberties Union. And that really felt like, something that my whole life was pointing me to, and a particular role that ended up being a kind of answer to what was my purpose. My purpose was to help keep the ACLU afloat for about 30 years, including a dozen years as president, through very difficult times with a lot of challenges to civil liberties under the Trump administration.
Tell me about your current role right now.
Well, my current role right now is I teach at Brooklyn Law School. And just about at the same time that I stepped down as president of the American Civil Liberties Union.
Susan retired as the president of the ACLU in January of 2021, which she held from 2008, which oversaw the Obama and Trump administration. Again, some of the most active years for the organization.
And just a couple of months before that, I had a very great honor at my law school, where the law school created a chair to honor a very great woman who was also a girl born in Brooklyn, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So my title right now is I am Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Professor of Law. So every time I look at my email signature line, I feel inspired.
I mean, there's a lot of gravity to that.
There is a lot of gravity to that. I think Justice Ginsburg is somebody, I met her when she was a judge, and then I knew her some while she was on the Supreme Court. We never worked together at the ACLU, but she was somebody who is credited with really helping the ACLU to get serious about doing work about gender stereotyping. And she was someone whose work I had always known. She was general counsel of the ACLU before I was general counsel. And so the whole feeling that I am carrying on her work and that we're part of the same purpose and the same team is something that's very important to me.
And so I want to ask you, when you were president of the ACLU, Just tell me a little bit about that role and what that was like.
Different organizations use terms in different ways. At the ACLU, being president means that I was not the person who ran the organization day to day. That person we call the executive director, who's currently Anthony Romero. As president, I chaired the board of directors, and all non-for-profits have two different aspects to them. There's the staff, the people who run things day to day, and then there's the board of directors, which sets the policy for the organization and sets the budget and and the mission. And so people who are interested in a particular field can often go on, even if you don't work for an organization directly in your day job, you can go on to be involved with a lot of organizations that do work that you believe in by serving on their board.
Tell me, like on a regular week, how much time did you put into it? What did your day look like?
It's impossible to say how many hours I spent on the ACLU and how many hours I spent on teaching, because I was lucky enough that my interest in the board that I was serving on overlapped what I was teaching about, which was constitutional law. And then I also did a lot of public speaking, partially for the ACLU and partially just as kind of a quote expert on various legal matters. So on an average day, I had like 6 different topics that I was thinking about, and things that I would think about would fall into different compartments. I would think, okay, here's a thought. I'm going to use this thought for my class, and I'm going to use that thought to write down for the speech I'm giving next week. And then I'm going to remember to tell the executive committee of the ACLU about this issue coming up, and maybe we need to plan for that. So it was just impossible to divide up the time. But again, I was lucky that everything that I was thinking about was related.
And not everybody can be that lucky. But one of the things I was thinking about was, being the president of the ACLU or, being in a place of influence can sometimes seem grueling and glamorous at the same time. What was it? What excites you about it? What was it like?
Well, I think what it was like was that sometimes, as you say, sometimes the things that I was doing were not very glamorous. They were all about chairing board meetings and knowing Robert's rules of order and making sure that people didn't speak too long so that other people could speak, not the glamorous part of the job. But then I also got called on to represent the ACLU in some pretty great contexts. So I was at a few meetings at the White House. I didn't actually meet President Obama, but I sat across from his chief of staff and his counsel. I went to like a dozen meetings at the Senate. I got to do some interesting international things. I was invited in Dublin to celebrate the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I was invited to do a reading from the steps of the Dublin City Hall of the Declaration of Human Rights, along with the Lord Mayor of Dublin and a few other people. So, there have been some really interesting things that I've gotten to do. And, some of them, as you say, some of them feel glamorous, but I think the real work is not necessarily in the glamour, but it's in the mission, in what you're trying to accomplish.
And that goes back to purpose. And if you know your purpose, then the mission is exciting and fun along the way, right?
I think that's right. But I think that also, purpose can sometimes be a daunting word. Mm-hmm. My husband used to say to my daughter, make sure that for your career, you're doing something you love. And we realized one day that was actually, it was a strange thing to say, because, what if you don't find something you love? Does that mean that there's something wrong? And if you don't have a sense of this is my purpose in life, does that mean that you should judge yourself to be a failure? So I think, there are a lot of different ways to judge how to have a good life and how to be passionate about what you're doing, even if you don't necessarily define that as this is my purpose.
But for Susan, she began to understand what she was passionate about at a very, 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 very young age.
Well, I was actually born in Brooklyn, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but when I was 3 years old, my family moved out to the suburbs, to Long Beach, New York. That's on Long Island. So I was lucky enough to have the beach all summer to go to. When people first ask me, how did you become a civil libertarian? How did you develop the values that kind of led to your sense of purpose? I trace that back to an incident that I remember when I was in the 3rd grade. And in my elementary school, we had a lot of student plays. The principal really liked student theatrics. And we were doing a play that was called Johnny Tremaine, which was the story of a boy during the American Revolution. And I thought the play was quite interesting. So I decided that I would find out what else had happened in the story by checking the book out of the library, because I knew that the play had been based on a book. So I went to the library, found the book on the shelf, and took it up to the librarian so I could check it out. And she said, "Oh, no, dear, you can't take out that book. That's in the boys section." Yeah, gasp, right?
Well,
So, I knew there was a girls section because I had been reading the books in the girls section, which were, catch this, they were collections of fairy tales and biographies of presidents' wives, and the occasional Clara Barton. And it had never actually occurred to me that I wasn't allowed to take books out of the boys section. That wasn't just a recommendation. So I went home and I told my mother about this. Just interesting thing happened today, but it didn't really occur to me that there was something wrong with it. I thought that was just the way things were. And my mother was furious. The idea that anybody was telling her daughter, what not to read, which is also therefore about what you can't dream about being or doing.
yeah.
And so she called up the librarian, and within a few days, I was told that I could take any book I wanted out of the library. And I should please tell my mother not to call again. And that in a few months, the library just changed its policy. And that to me, I think even if you don't realize it at the time, early experiences like that, I think can form your values. And the idea that my mother had stood up to an authority that was trying to mold me into their preconceived idea of what girls should do, and that she could fight that back and she could win. I think that was a really important occasion to me.
Though Susan was a child of the 60s, her high school experience was more about writing than activism.
Well, what I remember about it, my first year in high school was in the old building at one end of town. And then after my first year, we moved to the new building, which was completely at the other end of town in Lido Beach. And it looked sort of like a country club. There were very modern buildings and very long halls and a lot of windows. So it was very easy to have your attention distracted during class. There was a golf course that was right nearby.
And what sort of topics were you interested in?
Well, at the time, I think I was very interested in writing. I was interested in theater. I was never a STEM person. That was just not my path. I think when I went to college, I think that I was always headed towards something I thought maybe in the arts or something like that. But my father had been a lawyer, and he felt that it was not right for a woman to be a lawyer. He would talk about women who he knew who were lawyers and how it was really very sad because they weren't didn't have families or didn't have enough time to spend with their families. So I had never thought about being a lawyer when I was in high school or college. It was just not something that occurred to me. It was expected by my mother and father that I would be an English teacher to teach other kids Johnny Tremain.
Well, and was that because you were into writing, or was that just kind of something that was expected at the time?
Well, I think part of what was expected at the time was that a woman had to have a job that would fit around having children and around homemaking responsibilities, and that teaching was good because of the academic calendar, and it was an appropriate thing for a woman to do. I have in law school now. For years, I was seeing older women who came to law school after having started a career as a teacher or a nurse or something that they had been expected to do, and then they woke up one day and said, "I don't have to do this. I could do something else, not the thing that I was kind of geared toward and expected to do."
I want to ask you, so you were interested in English, you were interested in the arts. Did you ever have any challenges in high school that you faced, and how did you tackle them?
I think the challenge in high school is that you're a teenager. That's the worst challenge. And being a teenager, the sort of the building self-confidence and not giving into other people's judgments of you and not giving into everybody caring about how people looked or things that seem pretty superficial. I think to me that's the real challenge of high school. But I think high school is challenging for everybody because adolescence is challenging.
As I mentioned before, all around Susan, the civil rights movement was building. In fact, the year before she graduated from high school, the March on Washington happened.
I think at one point I was interested in going south for the summer or going to the march or something like that, and I asked my mother if I could, and she said no. So I kind of ruled out that this was anything I was going to be involved in at the time.
But the seeds of civil liberties and their importance in everyone's lives were still being sown in Susan's path. However, there were still several steps in her journey before she dove into what would be her calling. Well, and so you went directly to college after high school. Why did you choose to do that as opposed to taking like a gap year?
Well, at the time, nobody thought of gap years. That just wasn't something that people thought of. Again, the expectation was that you would just go straight to college after high school. The people who were lucky enough to be able to manage to get to college. And I feel like now there are so many more opportunities for people to decide that maybe they would actually do better taking a year off and doing something else, and kind of figuring out more what they want to do with their college experience.
And so what was your focus in college?
My focus in college, I was a philosophy major because I liked reading and thinking about ideas, and I was able to read novels and plays by myself. That wasn't a problem. And I felt like you can't really read philosophy by yourself. That's hard. You need somebody to kind of lead you through it and to talk about it with. So that was my major. And I did some theater when I was in college.
Is there anything with philosophy that stuck with you through, the things that you've been doing or the concepts that you've been exploring?
I think everything about philosophy has stuck with me because law is a lot like philosophy. It's all about arguments and about building arguments. And when people write a legal brief, it's really just like what's called in philosophy a syllogism. It's like you have to convince people. So you have to convince them of the major point, and then you convince them of the minor point, and then they have to reach your conclusion. So I think philosophy it was very good training for just how to think.
Then at 19, Susan switched schools and moved to New York to go to Barnard.
Women could not go to Columbia, and that was one of the things that I discovered, which was annoying.
And the reason she moved was actually not for academics. Sometimes we make decisions for love.
You want to talk about your early life choices. So when I was 19, I got married. And so I moved to back to New York because I was married. It was a first marriage. It turned out to be a starter marriage. And that's another place where people sometimes ask, are there things in your life that you regret? And even if you have a marriage that doesn't work, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's something to regret, because it's all part of the experience that ends you up where you end up. So I'm sure I learned a lot from that experience. But anyway, that's why I ended up moving.
There are no mistakes in life. There's just the journey. And that journey leads us on the path that we are supposed to be on. And for Susan, it was at Barnard, under a tree, studying philosophy and watching activists fight for their beliefs.
Well, it certainly affected me again in ways that I think I might not have known immediately how it might affect me long term. But my senior year at Barnard was the Columbia strike. And there were students demonstrating all over the place. And my philosophy seminar, my senior year philosophy seminar, was held outdoors under a tree because that was considered not breaking the strike if you met outdoors and if you talked about the strike instead of talking about the subject matter of the class.
You mentioned that Columbia didn't allow women at the time. I can't believe that. Tell me a little bit about why that angered you and just a little bit of the circumstance around that.
Well, that's the circumstance at the time when women's colleges were there were the Seven Sisters that were the counterpart to the Ivies, and it just was not expected that co-education was the thing that you did. So Barnard, because it was only for women, did not allow you to take courses at Columbia unless they were things that you couldn't get at Barnard. So if you wanted to take, Arabic or rocket science or whatever it was that Barnard wasn't offering, then you could take courses at Columbia. But the courses in the areas that I was interested in, like philosophy, English, etc., were not cross-listed, and I wasn't allowed. And there were particular times when I really would have loved to take courses with Lionel Trilling and Eric Bentley and some really great minds at Columbia, but I wasn't allowed. It was just like the girls section and the boys section.
It would be 3 years before Susan went to law school. You see, she thought she nailed her dream job at an entertainment magazine. Well, I'll let her explain it.
I thought for a while that I was going to go into the theater, but that turned out not to work out. So I was editor of a magazine about classical music and the performing arts. It was sort of like Playbill magazine. It was called Bravo, but it was about music instead of being about theater. And it was a very nice job. I got to go to a lot of concerts and meet people, but I started having this sense of irrelevance.
Even though this had been what she thought she wanted, something didn't quite fit. Sometimes you need to explore career options before diving in. That's why internships and mentorships are so great. But Back to Susan. Broadway wasn't calling. It was the courtroom.
And I just felt, I was just a child of the 60s. And so I really felt that I needed to be doing something to matter, to make a difference. And I decided that law would be the thing to do to really be able to, to help bring about positive change in the world, in the country.
So she was off to the mahogany libraries of law school, and she chose NYU Law.
NYU at the time was one of the first schools to be almost half women in the law school class. And I also applied to Columbia Law School, but I didn't want to go there because I had visited Columbia Law School when I was at Barnard. And in the entire building, there were only 2 bathrooms for women. And so, it was such a sign of, women not really being, expected. There were some law schools at the time that had what they called Ladies' Day, where they would call on the women in the class specially on Ladies' Day. And so NYU just felt like a better place to be because it was a place where, women were a heavy part of the population.
And although the days were long, she found ways to optimize her studying. This skill can be transformative if you learn how to harness the power of it. It will help you with your time management and ultimately project execution. Here's how Susan did it.
Yeah, I think that my tactic for studying is that you have to know yourself and you have to know, what you can get out of yourself when. So my husband is very good at sitting in the same place and really keeping himself to task. And that's not the best strategy for me. I'll sit down and read or be working on whatever I'm working on for a while, and then I have to walk around and do something else, and then I sit down again, and then I have my times when I can be doing projects where I really have to think about things like writing a book or planning a speech, and then there are times when I just I know that I'm not going to be useful if I try to think great thoughts at that moment because I'm tired or whatever. But what I can do is to get through the to-do list of the things that have to be filed in different places or just little things to be taken care of. So I think my strategy for getting things done is partially know yourself and know how to manage yourself. The other major part of my strategy is to-do lists. You have to have the to-do list and you have to know your sense of triage of what you really have to do and when you have to do it by.
That is so important. I am a classic procrastinator. So
I think we all are. We all are. It's just a question of how you manage yourself. I think the other thing about, if you find yourself to be procrastinating, I think the other thing that I think would not be successful for me as self-management would be to scream at myself. And to be mean to myself, and I'm doing it wrong. I shouldn't be procrastinating. Sometimes some procrastination is okay, as long as you know when you really have to kind of draw the line for yourself and okay, this is happening now. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to do it.
It's hard to say what might be more important, optimizing studying or creating opportunities. But for Susan, she didn't take any chances. She pursued both. I loved reading a little bit about your relationship with your teachers. You were a research assistant in law school. And one of the things I find really important in careers is the network that you build and the mentors that you build. And it looks like you did a really good job of creating that around you. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience as a research assistant and really how that was helpful in boosting the direction of your career?
Right. So I think I was very fortunate, but I also put myself in the way of that luck. So when I was a first-year student, one of the professors I found very interesting, Larry Sager, was involved with the New York Civil Liberties Union. He was counsel to them. And he had a project that they were working on at the time of looking at different Supreme Court justices and trying to figure out what kinds of arguments would appeal to particular justices. So he asked for volunteers to work on that project, and I volunteered. So then I went to his office to report to him on what I had done. And we had a good conversation. So he ended up asking me if I would be his research assistant that summer. So I decided that I would do that. And we were supposed to be working on a law review article that he was writing. I was supposed to be researching that. But instead, we ended up working on a case about 6 graduate students at Stony Brook who were suddenly told that they were not allowed to be living together in the house that they had rented because they were violating a zoning ordinance that prohibited a house in this village of Belterre to be used by anything other than a single family.
That experience would change her life.
So I went out to see those students and to tell them what was going on. And they took me on a tour of the village, including driving over to the residents-only beach. And when when the wheels hit the parking lot there, this large man came running across the parking lot and said, "What are you doing here? You are not legal residents. You're not allowed to be here." So they all looked at me. And I'm thinking, well, I'm not very big. What am I supposed to tell this large man who doesn't want us in his parking lot? And so then I remembered I had this federal court order that was right in my bag. So I drew myself up and I said, well, I'm with the New York Civil Liberties Union, sort of. And I have a federal court order here that says that these people are allowed to be at this beach. And he looked at me and he looked at the order and he melted. And I thought, this is cool. I want to do this. So it was as close as I ever came to the Mississippi sheriff, just this authority where in fact the power of law was greater than this bully.
And that was the start of a career dedicated to fighting for civil liberties. And now most of the time when you think of lawyers, you think of someone who joins a firm. That was not Susan's path.
After I graduated, I had a clerkship, a pro se clerkship, which meant that I was looking at applications from people who didn't have lawyers, analyzing them for the court.
Explain to me what that looked like and what you were working on there.
Well, there we worked on a few different kinds of things because the prisoners were people who I had seen a lot in my clerkship because they usually did not have lawyers. And they had two different kinds of claims. One was they all wanted to get out of prison, so they were all challenging the constitutionality of their convictions. So that was an area of law that was interesting to me. Under what circumstances do you say that a conviction is unfair? What's the due process involved before you can convict somebody? And sometimes you need to look back and say that was wrong, and this conviction needs to be reversed. So I still teach about those areas. So that was one area that I was handling. They were called habeas corpus petitions, where petitioners were asking to have somebody look again at their trial or whatever had happened that led them to be in prison.
So why did you not choose to go to a firm?
Well, that was never what was interesting to me. My goal was not to make a lot of money and to do something that other people defined as prestigious. I had gone to law school because I was interested in the possibility of using the power of the law to promote justice. And it may sound corny, but I think civil libertarians tend to believe in justice and equality, and that was what I wanted to do. And so I just found different ways to do that. And then when I went into teaching, I was teaching about the same subjects.
And so now clerkships are grueling. They are, right? At least my understanding. Because it takes a lot to do those, but there's a reason to. So why would you suggest doing a clerkship?
Well, I think it's like any other mentoring experience. You get to learn from the people who you're clerking for. And I wasn't just clerking for one judge, but I worked with a number of judges. And you get to see from the inside, what work is like. I think it's like any other internship. If you actually see what work is like, then you know a lot about what's going to make you want to get up in the morning and whether you would want to do a job like that.
Now, all too often, I think, myself and probably a lot of others want to skip steps, right? Just want to get to the big prize, get to that, job. What's valuable in taking your time and taking certain steps before you potentially do that dream career, dream job?
I think what's valuable about trying different things is that sometimes you can surprise yourself in terms of what's interesting to you. And so I think I often tell students you have a lot of opportunities during 3 years in law school. There are courses, there are clinics, there are internships, summer jobs. Try as many things as you can because you may surprise yourself in what you really find interesting and what's really going to click for you.
So you seem to be a little more laser focused on helping those, especially those that didn't necessarily have the ability to get counsel, because you went from your clerkship to the Prisoners Legal Services of New York.
Right.
Explain to me what that looked like and what, you were working on there.
Well, there we worked on a few different kinds of things because the prisoners were people who I had seen a lot in my clerkship because they usually did not have lawyers. And they had two different kinds of claims. One was they all wanted to get out of prison, so they were all challenging the constitutionality of their convictions. So that was an area of law that was interesting to me. Under what circumstances do you say that a conviction is unfair? What's the due process involved before you can convict somebody? And sometimes you need to look back and say that was wrong, and this conviction needs to be reversed. And then a second category of cases involved the conditions in prison and prisoners' rights. And there was a lot to say there.
Susan's passion for her work is clear. And as we were talking about her early career, she stopped for a moment to explain the relevance even today that this is an ongoing issue.
There are people who don't always have the autonomy and the dignity to be able to realize themselves because some governmental institution is steering them or holding them down. And from my little experience with the library in the third grade, where they were trying to tell me what books to read, that problem writ much larger is the problem that so many people have. So I'll give you an example of what I did not confront at the time. But a real problem today is that our prisons and jails and the places where the ICE does immigration detention have just been a hotbed of infection during the pandemic. And so the ACLU, among other organizations, have had to go to court to really try to litigate, to try to force government officials to treat the people who are in prisons and jails fairly, because it's not supposed to be a death sentence. And if you're in a prison or a jail, you can't socially isolate. A lot of people don't even have enough soap to sing happy birthday once, and people are transferred back and forth. So that is kind of an extreme example today of the kind of inattention to prison conditions. And I think from a very young age, I don't know what causes this, but I just really felt for people who were being treated as if they didn't matter. The students and the graduate students who were being told that they couldn't live with who they wanted to live with. It's a whole theme. They can't do that to you. They can't tell you who to be and that you're not important.
And that brings us to some of the most pivotal years in her career and leadership at the ACLU. You came into the ACLU as the president in 2008. What did you hope to accomplish when you came in, and how did things change?
Well, I'll tell you, I think it's an interesting story about what you expect and then what actually happens. So one thing that I planned to do when I became president, I wrote a transition memo. And one thing that I wanted to do was to look at our internal governance structures, how the board was structured. The ACLU has 54 affiliates, and each affiliate has a representative on the national board. And so the national board was 81 people, because there were also additional representatives. And that it's really hard to have a good conversation with 81 people. So we were talking about whether there were things that you could do to improve the management. And this is kind of the difference between being on the board of a not-for-profit organization and being on the staff. If the staff is doing the litigation, the board is not only worrying about the mission, but I as president was worried about whether we were being as effective as we should be and as representative, or whether we needed a change of structure. Well, that took a few years. We did have some structural changes, which I think were very good. We now have an executive committee that actually works more on the budget, which is really important. Follow the money and you know what an organization is doing. And it was too hard with 81 people. With 12 people, you can do it. But with 81, you really couldn't. So that was one thing I expected to do. What I did not expect was just the buckets and buckets and buckets of work that came. So, as if we weren't busy enough, with the challenges to voting rights and reproductive freedom and everything else. During the Trump administration, I would say that the ACLU works in 14 areas of civil rights and civil liberties, and so did the Trump administration, just from the opposite side. So the ACLU brought over 400 legal actions against the Trump administration about a wide variety of subjects, including the immigration subjects, rights for people who are trans, just all sorts of things. Then on top of that, all of a sudden the pandemic hit. And that meant that while I was president, we had all these ACLU lawyers who had to now work remotely from home. So that was a tremendous management issue. Yeah, how do you do all that work when you're sitting at your computer and trying to juggle a toddler and a cat, right? Which, a lot of people really understand what that's like.
Yeah.
Then there was all the litigation that needed to be done around the pandemic. Can you have a fair election during the pandemic? What about all these people who were incarcerated? What about there were kind of opportunistic limitations on things like reproductive freedom. Some states said, well, abortion is not an essential medical procedure. It's kind of optional, and therefore you should just wait until the pandemic is over to have your abortion. We're not going to let you in. So that didn't work. So that was like another wave of things that happened. Then on top of that, then came the murder of George Floyd and all the protests, which the ACLU was very much involved in. And then the entire new opportunity to really be rethinking racial justice, which is something that the ACLU is very much involved in right now. So I feel like, one thing that I was doing was to kind of keep the ship steady during, wave after wave. These were such turbulent times. And the other thing that I was doing was to set us up to be more inclusive. So when I became president in 2008, I went to Deborah Archer, who at the time was running an Institute for Racial Justice, and she was on the board. And I said to her, would you please be the national national equity officer? And that meant working with all the affiliates on whether or not they were doing searches for executive directors in a way that was inclusive. And they weren't. They would advertise that they wanted people with civil liberties experience, which means that they would only get people who were kind of already in the pool, and they weren't really looking for other kinds of candidates. So I said to Deborah, if the ACLU can't get this right to figure out how to be inclusive, what hope is there for the rest of the country? So Deborah did that for 12 years, and we all worked very hard at the ACLU on being inclusive, to the point where now the National Board of Directors is 60% people who identify as non-white. We have any number of staff and affiliate executive directors and people who are not white, and the organization has become so much more inclusive and diverse. And that really, it's such a tremendous advantage to be able to hear all those different voices. So I feel like, the punchline, which I'm almost forgetting to tell you here, is that my successor is Deborah Archer. All three of the people who were running for president were people who were not white. And so I am just thrilled to see that, that Deborah is, it's like, a whole new chapter for the ACLU.
And she's the first Black woman.
She is the first Black anything. She is the first person of color. Our executive director is a gay Puerto Rican man. So, we've had diversity of different forms, but, it is definitely an advance.
That is an incredible accomplishment. Amazing. Chatting with Susan, you really start to understand that not only was she a part of a group of pioneering women dynamically changing the legal profession, but also that she was keenly aware of raising others up with her.
I think I've been lucky in my career because I have not felt that I was on the cutting edge and that there were no other women in the room. There are some situations where, women are certainly in the minority. And I think that the advice has to be, you can hold your own. That the expectations that men have, sometimes they think that they're going to be able to mansplain and, kind of use up all the oxygen in the room. And I think that the real task is to learn how to hold your own and have your say without pretending that you're somebody else. When I was in law school, one of the first women law professors there was trying to imitate a male professor who she had in law school, who was really a real martinet. He was very strict, and it didn't really work for her. And so I feel you don't become a successful woman by trying to imitate being a man. You figure out, there are a lot of women who are, they're soft-spoken, but they're going to get their words in.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg was.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg, yes, indeed.
Be yourself. Not only do you need to know how you work, but be true to yourself on every level, especially when it comes to career growth and picking your trajectory. How did you approach career advancement? Because I feel like you took a different approach than just, maybe someone climbing the corporate ladder, or, you were picking strategic opportunities. How did you go about doing that?
Well, I feel like that my career was never about advancement. I never saw it, as a, a progress where I was trying to get to a certain point. Um, I was feeling, to me, the what I was trying to accomplish was more important. But having said that, I guess in a way it's really not true, because when you become an academic, there is a progression to getting tenure and to, to getting promotions and so forth. So that again, I didn't. There were enough people around me. There were enough women around me that it wasn't a particular problem for me. It's not that academia doesn't have issues about whether they don't value some of the scholarship that women do as much as the scholarship that men do. Yeah, there are still a lot of issues about the inclusion of women in different professions and in the economy. One of the things that the ACLU is working on a lot is just equal opportunity for women in the workplace. It's still the case that women do not get paid the same amount for equal work. There's pregnancy discrimination. There's childcare problems, and all sorts of things that really make it difficult for women to have the same opportunities that men would have. I never felt that those things really were holding me back. Although it's always difficult to juggle when you have a career and you're also a mother.
Well, what would you say your most valuable skill is?
Well, I think I have, in saying what my most valuable skill is, I think in two different directions. One is kind of the procedural direction. One of my most valuable skills is time management. I have all those to-do lists, and I know how to get myself to do the preparation that I need to do by the appropriate time. So I think I couldn't get anywhere without that. In terms of my other most important skill, I think that I have had success as a speaker and running the ACLU and in a number of contexts, because I think that I assume that people will be reasonable, and I think I can speak to what's reasonable in people instead of yelling at them or using a bunch of adjectives. I'm really trying to talk to people, and I hope that I'm able to communicate. But a lot of these things, you don't have to start out that way. A lot of these things are acquired skills.
So I want to pause for a minute. There is one thing that keeps standing out to me. I couldn't help but wonder, for someone who seems to have such a level perspective on how she's approached her career choices and opportunities, why did she choose a role that by its nature is always surrounded in controversy? So what is it like building a career that you've been fighting for others, and then, your time as the president of the ACLU, you've been fighting so many important issues, but most of them are controversial. And so my question is, what is it like kind of being in a career where everything around you is controversial? How do you handle that?
How do I handle that? Well, I think that I am pretty stubborn. So I've been in many situations of giving speeches, sometimes in places where, people give me standing ovations and they completely agree. And some places where I have really very hostile audiences. And so I've just learned to stand my ground and to argue with people. I'll tell you one wonderful experience that I had. I was speaking at the U.S. Army War College, where all these officers and people from actually all over the country go to learn about strategy, military strategy. And the people there were, the military is really very diverse politically. But there was one person who I met, whom my host introduced me to. He was a lieutenant colonel. And after I spoke, I was introduced to him, and he said, well, that was a really nice pitch. He said, before you spoke, I was determined to disagree with everything you said. He said, but then, you were saying this, then, and I started thinking to myself, whoa, wait a minute, what do I think? And so I think that, part of my sense of what's controversial is I do truly believe that our country is founded on civil libertarian principles, that everybody should have the right to decide what they're going to say and what their religion is and how to run their family, that everybody should be treated equally, that everybody should be treated fairly. And I feel like I truly believe that if I could sit down with almost anybody in the country, if we could just talk long enough, that they would understand that position. I know some of them are just determined to have their minds closed.
This is actually one of my favorite questions because I find it fascinating. What word have you been called that you actually think is one of your best characteristics?
What word? Well, people call me reasonable, which I think I am. I think also it's maybe not a word, but the idea that I listen to people and that I try to be inclusive. I don't just talk to them. I want to know what other people think. And the other thing that actually somebody once said to me, another woman said to me, which was almost an accusation, she said, "You're nice." You can be nice.
If you could go back and tell yourself anything at 15 years old, what would it be?
I think I would want to tell my 15-year-old self that I was not as grown as I ever would be, and that I was going to develop more, and that I would learn new things, and that I might change my mind about some things. And I think I would also tell my 15-year-old self that I was never going to be in a career where people were going to care a whole lot about how I looked. So, when you're 15, you're always worrying about, are you going to get, the zit when you have an important party? And, I think what I've learned since then is that nobody really cares. If I'm having a bad hair day, it's not like people aren't going to listen to me because I'm having a bad hair day.
If a young woman wanted to pursue your path, what advice would you give them?
Well, I'd give them first the advice of don't pursue my path, pursue your own path. But if people want to get involved in justice and law and whatever it is, they're helping people, whatever it is, one of my favorite sayings is the Buddhist adage, paths are many. So you find your own way. You start small. You just start with, if you see something that you think is unjust, it's like, if you see something, say something. You just find a way to engage, find a way to help people, find a way, and I think this is very important, find a way to talk to people who you don't agree with and to explain to them why you think they're wrong.
And that is it. The unfiltered, undeterred journey of Susan Herman, a passionate trailblazer fighting for civil rights. And now it's time for the Mind the Ceiling Mindful Minute with Anika Uden, our podcast apprentice and potentially your company's next CEO. Anika, take it away.
To start off, what book changed your life or impacted you the most?
I was telling the story before about how I wasn't allowed to take out the book of Johnny Tremain in the library. So that book in a way did change my life. But if you're looking for a different answer, I think one book that I just found so moving that I read was Nelson Mandela's autobiography.
Definitely a powerful
piece.
Yeah. Who is your most influential role model?
I would like to say Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yes, RBG. What organizational tool can you not live without?
Well, I think at this point, my phone is the most important organizational tool because that's where I have all my appointments and all my to-do lists and all the contacts, etc. So, I'm not unusual in being totally dependent on the cell phone.
It's crazy what technology can do these days.
Yeah.
What do you do to find calm or to chill out, to relax?
Well, to relax, one of the things that I've done for years is I sing in a chorus. And the music to me is like meditation. You're just going to rehearsal and I'm not in charge and I just kind of become part of the flow of the music.
Wow. And then to wrap up, final question is, if you could have a superpower, what would it be and why?
Wow. I think if I could have the superpower, I think what I would want is a superpower to change people's minds. All the people who kind of believe that the world is not as it is, or who don't, who regard other people as less than human. And what I would like to be able to do is change the minds of those people who are getting in our way.
Insightful. So thank you so much. That was it for the Mindful Minute.
And that is our show, Mind the Ceiling. And here we don't mind the ceiling because it's meant to be shattered. We are here for you, so please subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to us, follow us on social media, and share with your friends. And we'd love to hear from you. Hit us up on social media to ask our guests questions or celebrate your successes with us. We would love to cheer you on your journey. And with that, what makes us excited about the future?
Well, I think what makes me excited about the future is feeling that it's like a relay race. It's like a marathon. And so I have passed the baton on at the ACLU to somebody who I think is great. And we have all these wonderful younger people on staff. And in my personal life, I have a 2-year-old granddaughter. And what makes me most excited about the future is that there are all these people behind us who are coming up to take the baton and who are going to make the world a really very different and I hope much better place.